Wonder what folks ate during America's toughest economic crisis? The Great Depression hit hard in 1929, and suddenly families across the nation had to make every penny and every ingredient count. Church communities became crucial centers for sharing recipes that could feed many on a tight budget. These dishes weren't just about survival, they became comfort foods passed down through generations. Let's dive into 25 incredible church recipes from the Great Depression era that are still worth making today. These dishes combine simplicity, affordability, and surprisingly delicious flavors that have stood the test of time. Poor man's steak. Poor man's steak emerged as a creative alternative when beef was too expensive for most families. This ingenious dish takes humble ground beef, stretches it with cracker crumbs or oatmeal, shapes it into a steak, then coats it with flour and browns it in a skillet. The magic happens when it's smothered in a simple gravy made from milk, flour, and the pan drippings. Church cookbooks from the 1930s frequently featured variations of this recipe, making it a staple at community suppers and potlucks. The First Baptist Church of Cedar Rapids, Iowa, included a version in their 1933 community cookbook that became particularly well known. What made poor man's steak so practical was how it could feed a family of 6 with just a pound of ground beef, a true budget miracle during tough times. Typically served with mashed potatoes to soak up the gravy, this dish embodied the Depression-era philosophy of making humble ingredients taste special. Today, it remains a comfort food classic, reminding us of the resourcefulness that defined a generation. Potato soup. Potato soup stands as perhaps the most quintessential Great Depression dish, beloved in church communities across America. This hearty staple was built on the cheapest vegetable available, the humble potato. The basic recipe required just potatoes, onions, water, milk, or sometimes just the water potatoes were boiled in, butter, if available, and salt and pepper. Church gatherings often featured large pots of potato soup, especially during monthly community meals where everyone needed to be fed on pennies. The Methodist Women's Auxiliary in rural Minnesota published a recipe in 1932 that became widely shared, noting that a pot of potato soup can feed 12 hungry souls for less than $1. The genius of Depression-era potato soup was its flexibility. Households added whatever they had available. Leftover ham bones provided flavor, wild onions could be foraged, and even potato peels were sometimes included for extra nutrition. Some cooks added a sprinkle of flour for thickness when milk wasn't available. Today, potato soup remains a comforting reminder of how simple ingredients can create something truly satisfying, with modern versions often adding cheese, bacon, or herbs, luxuries that would have been rare during the Depression itself. Water pie. Water pie sounds impossible, a dessert where the main ingredient is literally water. Yet this ingenious creation became a signature of church bake sales during the Depression when milk, fruits, and nuts were often unaffordable luxuries. The recipe originated in Southern church communities, with the First Presbyterian Church of Memphis having one of the earliest documented versions in their 1931 fundraising cookbook. The pie uses a simple pastry crust filled with a mixture of water, sugar, flour, butter, and vanilla extract. When baked, the ingredients transform almost magically into a custard-like filling with a delicate, sweet flavor. Church gatherings frequently featured water pie because it could be made in quantity with minimal ingredients. One minister's wife from Oklahoma was reportedly famous for bringing 6 water pies to every church function, feeding dozens of people for just pennies per slice. The pie's subtle sweetness and surprising texture delighted Depression-era diners who had little access to fancy desserts. Today, water pie enjoys periodic revivals as people rediscover this remarkable example of creativity born from necessity. Dandelion salad. Dandelion salad represents the Depression-era practice of foraging for free food. Church communities taught members to identify edible wild plants, with dandelions being among the most accessible and nutritious options available in nearly every yard and field. The Lutheran Ladies' Aid Society in Pennsylvania, Dutch country, published a widely circulated recipe in 1934, instructing members to gather young dandelion greens before the plants flowered, when the leaves are most tender and least bitter. The greens were typically dressed with a warm bacon dressing made from bacon drippings, vinegar, sugar, and sometimes a hard-boiled egg. Church picnics in spring often featured dandelion salads as a welcome fresh vegetable after winter's limited options. The practice of gathering dandelions became a community activity, with children often sent to collect the greens while learning valuable lessons about nature's bounty. Rich in vitamins A and C, dandelion greens provided crucial nutrition during a time when fresh produce was a luxury many couldn't afford. Modern nutritionists have rediscovered what Depression-era families knew by necessity. Dandelions are incredibly nutritious superfoods that grow abundantly for free. Vinegar pie. Vinegar pie emerged as a creative solution when fruit for pies was scarce or prohibitively expensive. This ingenious dessert uses vinegar to provide a tangy flavor reminiscent of lemon, creating a simple custard pie with ingredients most households had on hand. The First Methodist Church of Springfield, Illinois, included a treasured vinegar pie recipe in their 1930 community cookbook, describing it as a pie for when the apple barrel is empty. The standard recipe combines sugar, eggs, a small amount of vinegar, usually apple cider vinegar, butter, and warm spices like cinnamon or nutmeg in a single pie crust. Church socials often featured vinegar pies, especially during winter and early spring, when fruit was unavailable. Women's auxiliary groups would prepare these pies for fundraisers, appreciating how the inexpensive ingredients could be transformed into a dessert that sold for a much-needed profit. What made vinegar pie particularly practical was its shelf stability. Without fruit that could spoil, these pies could be made in advance of church gatherings. The subtle tanginess combined with warm spices created a comforting dessert that satisfied sweet cravings during the bleakest economic times. Hoover stew. Hoover stew gained its ironic name from President Herbert Hoover, who was widely blamed for the Depression. This one-pot meal became a fixture at church soup kitchens across America, feeding countless hungry families through community outreach programs. The Salvation Army developed one of the most widely used versions around 1932, creating a flexible recipe that could feed massive numbers of people inexpensively. The basic recipe combined hot dogs sliced to stretch further, macaroni, canned tomatoes, and whatever vegetables were available, often just onions and perhaps canned corn. Church soup kitchens could prepare enormous pots of Hoover stew, with some records showing batches that fed over 300 people at a single serving. The First Baptist Church of Detroit famously served Hoover stew twice weekly throughout 1933, providing over 15,000 meals to unemployed workers and their families. The dish's simplicity allowed for endless adaptation based on what donations came in. Beans might replace some of the hot dogs, different pasta shapes could be used, and any vegetable was welcome. This humble stew represents the critical role churches played in feeding America during its darkest economic hour. Wacky cake. Wacky cake, also called crazy cake or depression cake, solved the problem of making dessert without eggs, milk, or butter, all expensive or hard-to-find ingredients during the Depression. This ingenious chocolate cake became a staple of church bake sales and celebrations. The Women's Auxiliary of Grace Episcopal Church in Cleveland published one of the first documented recipes in their 1933 fundraising cookbook. The cake uses vinegar and baking soda for leavening, vegetable oil instead of butter, and cocoa powder for chocolate flavor. Most distinctively, the ingredients are mixed directly in the baking pan, creating fewer dishes to wash. Another practical consideration when soap was a luxury. Church functions frequently featured wacky cake because it could be made quickly, inexpensively, and in large quantities. Sunday school teachers would often prepare it for children's events, as it was both economical and reliably delicious despite its simple ingredients. The cake's moist texture and rich chocolate flavor defied its humble origins, proving that delicious treats were possible even in the hardest times. Modern bakers still appreciate wacky cake for its vegan-friendly ingredients, and foolproof preparation method. Ham and bean soup. Ham and bean soup epitomizes the Depression-era philosophy of stretching a small amount of meat to feed many people. Churches across America embraced this hearty, economical soup for community meals and food relief programs. The Ladies' Aid Society of the First Christian Church of Springfield, Missouri, published a notable recipe in their 1931 Community Cookbook, explaining that a single ham bone with a little meat still clinging to it can flavor enough soup to serve 20 hungry souls. The soup combines dried beans, usually navy or Great Northern, a ham bone or small pieces of ham, onions, and sometimes carrots or potatoes if available. Church basement kitchens would often have huge pots of this soup simmering during winter months, ready to serve to anyone in need. The lengthy cooking time softened the beans and extracted every bit of flavor from the ham bone, creating a rich, satisfying meal despite minimal ingredients. What made this soup particularly practical was its use of dried beans, an affordable, shelf-stable protein source that could be stored indefinitely. The tradition of serving ham and bean soup continued in many churches well beyond the Depression, becoming part of the American comfort food canon. Peanut butter bread. Peanut butter bread offered a protein-rich alternative to traditional breads when eggs and milk were scarce. This dense, satisfying bread became popular in church communities where feeding children nutritious food on a limited budget was a constant challenge. The recipe first appeared in the 1932 Five Roses Flour Cookbook, but quickly spread through church recipe exchanges. The First Presbyterian Women's Circle of Des Moines adapted a version that became widely shared, noting it was especially good for growing children's lunch pails. The simple recipe requires just flour, baking powder, salt, sugar, milk or water in the strictest times, and peanut butter, creating a hearty bread without yeast, eggs, or butter. Church bake sales often featured peanut butter bread, and it was frequently included in food baskets distributed to families in need. What made this bread particularly valuable was its protein content from the peanut butter, providing crucial nutrition when meat was unaffordable for many families. The dense texture and slightly sweet, nutty flavor made it popular with children, ensuring they would eat this economical food without complaint. Church supper casserole. Church supper casserole became the ultimate solution for feeding large groups with minimal ingredients during the Depression. This adaptable dish graced countless church fellowship halls across America, allowing communities to come together despite economic hardship. The Women's Missionary Union of First Baptist Church in Oklahoma City created a version in 1934 that spread widely throughout the Southern Baptist Convention churches. Their original recipe combined cooked macaroni, canned tomatoes, and whatever protein was available, often just a small amount of ground meat stretched with breadcrumbs, or sometimes just beans. What made church supper casserole particularly brilliant was its flexibility. It could incorporate virtually any vegetables, starches, or small amounts of meat available. The dish was typically topped with breadcrumbs mixed with a small amount of saved bacon grease for flavor and baked until bubbling and browned. If you're enjoying these Depression-era recipes and want to help us continue bringing this forgotten history to life, please consider supporting us on Patreon. The link is in the description below. Your membership helps us research and preserve these culinary traditions that tell the story of American resilience. Church communities relied on these casseroles for monthly potlucks and community outreach, with some congregations serving weekly community meals throughout the Depression years. The tradition of church casseroles that began during this era of necessity continues today, though modern versions typically include more abundant ingredients. Egg drop soup. Egg drop soup provided a protein-rich meal option when eggs were one of the few affordable proteins available, especially for rural church communities, where many families kept chickens even during the hardest times. The Women's Guild of St. Mary's Catholic Church in Chicago's ethnic neighborhoods adapted this simple soup from Chinese traditions, creating a version that used minimal ingredients. Just chicken broth, often made from bones or scraps, eggs, and perhaps a sprinkle of green onions or a bit of cornstarch for thickening. Church cooking demonstrations frequently featured egg drop soup as a way to teach economical cooking methods to struggling families. One parish priest in Philadelphia reportedly said, "With this soup, a family of 4 can have protein for pennies a day." The simple preparation involved slowly pouring beaten eggs into simmering broth, creating delicate ribbons of cooked egg. This technique turned a few eggs and basic broth into a satisfying, protein-rich soup that could serve as a complete meal with just a piece of bread on the side. Tomato soup cake. Tomato soup cake sounds bizarre to modern ears, but was a stroke of genius during the Depression when fresh fruit for cake was unaffordable. This spice cake uses canned tomato soup to provide moisture, acidity, and subtle flavor, replacing more expensive ingredients. The Methodist Women's Circle of Lansing, Michigan published a popular version in their 1936 community cookbook, claiming it was impossible to detect the secret ingredient. The cake combines a can of tomato soup with flour, sugar, lard or oil, spices like cinnamon and cloves, and baking soda, creating a moist spice cake reminiscent of modern carrot cake, but without costly additions. Church bake sales frequently featured tomato soup cake, often topped with cream cheese frosting when ingredients allowed, or simply dusted with saved sugar. The recipe was especially popular because Campbell's soup was relatively affordable and shelf-stable, allowing households to keep the ingredients on hand for special occasions. The cake's spiced flavor profile disguised its unusual origin, making it a favorite even among children who might otherwise resist vegetable-based desserts. This clever substitution represents the remarkable culinary creativity born from necessity during the Depression. Creamed chipped beef on toast. Creamed chipped beef on toast, affectionately known by less polite names among military servicemen, was a budget-friendly protein dish that featured prominently at church breakfasts and suppers during the Depression. The Lutheran Aid Society of Milwaukee included a detailed recipe in their 1934 community cookbook, praising it as satisfying fare for hungry families. The dish combines dried beef, rehydrated and rinsed to reduce saltiness, a simple white sauce made from flour, fat, and milk, all served over toast made from homemade bread. Church kitchens would prepare large trays of this dish for men's prayer breakfasts and evening meals for working families. The appeal lay in how a small amount of dried beef, shelf-stable and relatively inexpensive compared to fresh meat, could be stretched to feed many people when combined with the creamy sauce. Rural churches in particular embraced this recipe, as many farm families had access to milk even during hard times. The dish remains in American culinary memory as an example of making the most of limited resources, creating a satisfying meal from just a few basic ingredients. Corn chowder. Corn chowder became a staple of church suppers during the Depression, especially in rural communities where homegrown corn could be preserved for winter use. This hearty soup stretched minimal ingredients to feed many hungry people. The Women's Fellowship of the Congregational Church in rural Iowa published a respected recipe in 1933, emphasizing that a little salt pork and summer's corn can warm both body and spirit in winter's darkest days. Their version combined corn, fresh, canned, or rehydrated dried corn, potatoes, onions, and a small amount of salt pork for flavor, all simmered in water and sometimes finished with a splash of milk when available. Monthly church suppers frequently featured huge pots of corn chowder as the main course, often accompanied by simple biscuits or cornbread. The soup's appeal lay in its ability to create a filling meal primarily from vegetables that many rural families could grow themselves. What made corn chowder particularly valuable during the Depression was its adaptability. When milk was scarce, the soup could be made with just water. When meat was unavailable, the salt pork could be omitted entirely. This flexible, satisfying soup embodied the making-do spirit that helped communities survive economic hardship. Bread pudding. Bread pudding exemplified the waste-nothing philosophy of the Depression, transforming stale bread, which no family could afford to throw away, into a comforting dessert. Church communities embraced this thrifty dessert for both family meals and larger gatherings. The Episcopal Church, Women of Christ Church in Alexandria, Virginia, published a notable recipe in their 1932 community cookbook, describing bread pudding as the alchemy that turns yesterday's bread into today's comfort. Their recipe soaked stale bread in a mixture of milk, sugar, eggs, if available, applesauce if not, cinnamon, and perhaps a handful of raisins if such luxuries could be afforded. Church events often featured large pans of bread pudding, especially after communion services when leftover bread needed to be respectfully repurposed. The dish could be made in advance and served warm or cold, making it practical for community gatherings with limited cooking facilities. What made bread pudding particularly important during the Depression was its role in eliminating food waste. Even the hardest bread crusts could be softened and transformed. Many families received day-old bread from church relief programs, and bread pudding offered a way to make this charity feel like a treat rather than a hardship. Chowchow relish. Chowchow relish became essential for Depression-era meals by adding flavor to otherwise plain dishes. This mixed vegetable pickle utilized whatever garden produce was available, preserving summer's bounty for leaner months. The Baptist Women's Missionary Union, chapters throughout the South, popularized numerous variations, with a noteworthy recipe appearing in the 1935 community cookbook from First Baptist Church of Charlotte, North Carolina. Their version combined cabbage, green tomatoes, onions, peppers, and cucumbers in a vinegar-based pickling solution with mustard seeds and turmeric. Church canning circles would gather when gardens were producing to prepare large batches of chowchow, often using the church kitchen facilities where larger canning setups were possible. These community canning days served both practical and social purposes, allowing women to share labor and equipment while preserving food for their families and for church food relief programs. What made chowchow particularly valuable during the Depression was its ability to add interest and nutrition to monotonous diets. A spoonful could enliven a plate of beans, enhance a sandwich made with sparse fillings, or make plain cornbread feel like a more complete meal. Cabbage with hot bacon dressing. Cabbage with hot bacon dressing turned an affordable vegetable into a satisfying side dish during the Depression. Church communities valued this recipe for its ability to make humble cabbage feel like a special treat. The German Lutheran communities in Pennsylvania and the Midwest particularly embraced this dish, with St. Paul's Lutheran Church in Fort Wayne publishing a version in their 1933 recipe collection. Their recipe wilted shredded cabbage with a dressing made from a small amount of bacon, or just the saved drippings, vinegar, sugar, and sometimes a beaten egg for richness. Church suppers frequently included this dish in fall and winter, when cabbage was one of the few affordable fresh vegetables available. The preparation was often done right before serving, with the hot dressing poured over the raw cabbage to wilt it slightly while maintaining some crispness. What made this dish particularly practical during the Depression was cabbage's affordability, long storage life, and high vitamin content. The small amount of bacon or bacon drippings provided flavor without requiring much of this relatively expensive ingredient, embodying the Depression philosophy of making a little go a very long way. Milk toast. Milk toast represented perhaps the simplest comfort food of the Depression era, providing warm nourishment when little else was available. Church communities recommended this basic dish for feeding the sick, elderly, and very young when resources were severely limited. The Women's Christian Temperance Union, which was active in many churches, published a recipe in their 1931 household guide, noting that milk toast sustains body and spirit when nothing else can be afforded. The basic recipe involved toasting homemade bread, buttering it lightly if possible, then pouring warm milk over it, sometimes seasoned with a sprinkle of salt, sugar, or cinnamon. Church visiting committees would often prepare milk toast for shut-ins and ill congregation members, as it required minimal cooking facilities and ingredients that most households could manage even in dire circumstances. For families with a cow, milk toast provided a way to create a complete meal centered around this nutritious staple. What made milk toast particularly important during the Depression was its ease of digestion and basic nutrition, providing protein, carbohydrates, and calcium in a simple form. This humble dish symbolizes how Depression-era cooks found ways to create comfort with the barest of ingredients. Potato pancakes. Potato pancakes transformed the humble potato, often the most affordable food available, into a satisfying meal during the Depression. Church communities across various ethnic traditions shared their versions of this versatile dish. The Ladies' Aid Society of St. John's Lutheran Church in Wisconsin published a German-inspired recipe in 1934, explaining that 3 potatoes can become a meal for 4 when prepared this way. Their recipe grated raw potatoes, mixed them with a small amount of flour, an egg if available, or just water if not, and onions, then fried the mixture in small amounts of saved fat until crispy. Church community meals often featured potato pancakes, especially in ethnic communities with Eastern European or German heritage. The dish was particularly popular for Friday meals in Catholic parishes observing meatless days, providing a filling alternative to more expensive fish. What made potato pancakes especially valuable during the Depression was their ability to be a complete meal with just one main ingredient, perhaps served with applesauce or sour cream if available, but satisfying even on their own. The crispy texture and savory flavor made this economical dish feel like more than just another way to eat the ubiquitous potato. Mock apple pie. Mock apple pie stands as perhaps the most ingenious culinary deception of the Depression era, creating a dessert that tastes remarkably like apple pie without using a single apple. This creative substitution became popular when fruit was prohibitively expensive for most families. The recipe gained wide circulation through church cookbook exchanges, with the Presbyterian Women's Circle of Topeka, Kansas publishing a version in 1932 that claimed none will guess the secret ingredient. The pie fills a standard crust with Ritz crackers or similar crackers soaked in a syrup of sugar, water, cream of tartar, and lemon juice, which miraculously takes on an apple-like flavor and texture when baked. Church bake sales frequently featured mock apple pies, often not advertising their cracker base, making them something of a delightful surprise when the secret was revealed. The recipe became so popular that Ritz crackers began printing it on their packaging in 1934, though church communities had been sharing versions before the commercial promotion. What made mock apple pie particularly remarkable was how it addressed not just economic necessity, but also the psychological need for normalcy and small pleasures during hard times. The ability to serve apple pie, an iconic American dessert, even when real apples were unattainable, provided both physical and emotional nourishment. Bean patties. Bean patties offered an ingenious meat substitute during the Depression, creating satisfying protein-rich burgers from inexpensive dried beans. Church communities championed these economical alternatives at a time when meat was beyond many families' budgets. The Missionary Society of the First Methodist Church in Chicago published a frequently reproduced recipe in their 1933 economy cookbook, noting that these patties satisfy the desire for meat at a fraction of the cost. Their version mashed, cooked navy beans with a small amount of onion, breadcrumbs, and seasonings, then formed the mixture into patties and fried them until crisp. Church community kitchens would prepare large batches of bean patties for congregation meals, particularly for working-class parishes where meat had become a rare luxury. The patties were typically served with a simple gravy or tomato sauce to add moisture and flavor. What made bean patties particularly important during the Depression was their high protein content and satisfying texture at a time when nutritional deficiencies were a serious concern. These humble patties represent the creativity born of necessity, providing nourishment when conventional options were unavailable. Cornmeal mush. Cornmeal mush served as both breakfast and dinner for many families during the Depression, with church relief programs often distributing cornmeal as a staple food item. This simple porridge could be adapted for any meal of the day with minimal cost. The rural Methodist circuit riders who traveled between small country churches distributed a recipe card in 1932 describing cornmeal mush as the staff of life when wheat bread cannot be afforded. The basic recipe simmered cornmeal in water with a pinch of salt until thick, creating a simple porridge that could be eaten hot with milk and sugar for breakfast or cooled, sliced, and fried for dinner. Church food relief programs frequently provided demonstrations on preparing cornmeal mush in various ways to prevent families from growing tired of this necessity. The versatility was key: sweet for breakfast, savory with beans or greens for dinner, or fried with a bit of onion for a more substantial meal. What made cornmeal mush particularly crucial during the Depression was its extreme economy. A few cents worth of cornmeal could feed a family for multiple meals. This humble dish sustained countless Americans through the hardest years of economic collapse, with church communities providing both the ingredients and the knowledge to prepare it in varied ways. Pintos and cornbread. Pintos and cornbread became the Depression-era equivalent of fast food, inexpensive, filling, and quick to prepare. Church communities throughout the South and Southwest elevated this simple pairing to an art form, creating satisfying meals from minimal ingredients. The Baptist Women's Missionary Union of Oklahoma published a widely circulated recipe collection in 1934 that included detailed instructions for this staple meal, noting that a pot of beans and a pan of cornbread can satisfy a family for pennies a day. Their approach simmered pinto beans, slowly with just salt, and perhaps a piece of salt pork, if available, while the cornbread required only cornmeal, salt, water, and a small amount of lard or bacon drippings. Church fellowship halls across the country regularly served this simple meal for community gatherings, appreciating how it could feed large groups inexpensively. Some congregations held regular beans and cornbread suppers as fundraisers, charging just a few cents per plate while still raising money for church needs. What made this combination particularly important during the Depression was its complete nutrition. The beans provided protein and fiber, while the cornbread contributed complementary amino acids and carbohydrates. This humble meal sustained millions of Americans through economic hardship, with variations continuing as beloved comfort food long after the Depression ended. Onion sandwiches. Onion sandwiches represent Depression-era ingenuity at its most basic, creating a sandwich filling from one of the cheapest vegetables available. Church community cookbooks included this simple solution for lunch pails and quick meals. The United Methodist Women of rural Georgia included a notable recipe in their 1932 pamphlet, Feeding Families in Hard Times, instructing readers to slice sweet onions thin, soak in cold water to remove sharpness, then place between buttered bread with salt and pepper. For families who couldn't afford butter, a light spread of lard or drippings might be substituted. Church picnics sometimes featured these humble sandwiches, particularly in early spring, when storage onions were one of the few vegetables still available and new spring onions were just coming in. Children would be encouraged to gather wild greens like chickweed to add to the sandwiches when possible. What made onion sandwiches particularly useful during the Depression was how they provided both substance and flavor when more traditional sandwich fillings like meat or cheese were unattainable. The crisp texture and sweet, sharp taste of onions made these simple sandwiches more satisfying than their humble ingredients might suggest. Mayonnaise cake. Mayonnaise cake solved the problem of making a tender, moist chocolate cake without eggs or butter by using mayonnaise which contains both eggs and oil, as a clever substitution. Church bake sales featured this resourceful dessert throughout the Depression. The First Christian Church Women's Circle of Des Moines published a popular version in their 1935 fundraising cookbook, calling it Miracle Cake and noting that none will believe it begins with mayonnaise. Their recipe combined flour, sugar, cocoa powder, water, and mayonnaise to create a surprisingly rich chocolate cake without requiring expensive dairy ingredients. Church gatherings often included mayonnaise cake for celebrations and special occasions, as it allowed families to enjoy treats even when traditional baking ingredients were scarce. Sunday school teachers particularly favored this recipe for children's events, as it reliably produced a delicious cake despite its unusual method. What made mayonnaise cake particularly valuable during the Depression was how it repurposed a common sandwich spread into a dessert ingredient, creating something special from everyday items. This cake exemplifies the creativity that emerged when traditional approaches were no longer viable due to economic constraints. These 25 Great Depression church recipes aren't just historical curiosities, they're powerful reminders of human ingenuity and community support during America's darkest economic chapter. Church kitchens became laboratories where necessity sparked incredible creativity, turning the humblest ingredients into meals that nourished both body and spirit. These recipes tell stories of resourcefulness, of stretching pennies and ingredients to feed families and communities. They remind us that good food doesn't always require expensive ingredients or complicated techniques. Sometimes the simplest dishes provide the greatest comfort. Many of these recipes deserve a place in our modern kitchens, not just as historical experiments, but as delicious, economical options that connect us to previous generations. They're especially relevant today as many of us look for ways to reduce food waste, cook economically, and find comfort in uncertain times. Did this journey through Depression-era church kitchens whet your appetite for more food history? If you enjoyed exploring these resourceful recipes, make sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into America's culinary past. Until next time, happy cooking!